Hello, and welcome to another episode of Kings of History, a podcast where we will talk about all the kings of Portugal in chronological order. Today, you better be ready, because we have two great battles that are major historical events that shaped Portuguese history, with effects that are seen to this day. We'll also see that the cousins finally come to an understanding, and King Afonso Henriques tries to resolve his marital situation before setting off on his offensive to the south. Before we proceed, we would like to remind you all that you can listen to every single episode released so far on our website, kingsofhistory.buzzsprout.com, as well as on the most common podcasting platforms. You can also follow us on social media so that you are always updated regarding new releases and other fun things as well. Drop a follow and a like, it helps a lot. Let's resume our story, shall we? Possibly between the spring of 1136 and 1137, the Portuguese organized a large raid in the area of Ladeia, where we can find the municipality of Ancião today, in which Afonso Henriques took part in, and shortly afterwards another raid led by his chief ensign, Fernão Cativo, which integrated those lands into Portuguese territory. The conquest of these lands led Afonso Henriques to grant charters to Miranda do Corvo on the 19th of November 1136 and Penela in July 1137, with the aim of attracting people from the region between Douro and Minho to occupy these lands. For those who don't know, a charter was basically a royal document that organized the territory and regulated the duties and privileges of those who lived there, as well as taxation and whatever activities were to be held there. It was a way of providing territorial autonomy due to the implementation of municipal agencies and to solidify the authority of its ruler as well, in this case, Afonso Henriques. Shortly afterwards, the south of the peninsula, occupied by the Muslims, splintered even further into the so-called Second Taifa Kingdoms. This important change may have been another reason why Afonso Henriques hastily made a peace accord in Tui with his cousin. In April of 1139, King Afonso VII began the siege of Oreja, which was a bit to the south of what is now Madrid. This was the first step in the Castile-Leonese Reconquista in the 12th century, with the fall of the city in October. On the other side of the peninsula, in the early summer of 1139, Afonso Henriques gathers a force for a raid, which, according to some sources, would have reached Andalusia. On the way back, near Ourique, the Portuguese camp, which had been set up on top of a hill, was attacked by a much larger Muslim force. The battle took place, according to legend, on the 25th of July, the day of Saint James, who at the time was already the patron saint of the Reconquista. The enemy attack was held off, and the Portuguese even managed to thin out the enemy forces as they were retreating. This retreat was allegedly initiated by their leader, King Esmar. I'm now going to read you a translated and modernized version of the Chronicle of the Goths, which talks about the Battle of Ourique between the forces of Afonso Henriques and the Muslim forces led by King Esmar. A small side note for you who are listening: practically until the end of Portugal's first dynasty, time was reckoned according to the Hispanic era, also known as the era of Caesar, and not the Christian era, which comes from the acronym AD, or Anno Domini. So, when you listen to these excerpts from the Chronicles, subtract 38 from the years you've heard, since the Hispanic era is 38 years ahead of the Christian era. Era of 1177. On the 25th of July, the celebration of St. James the Apostle. In the 11th year of his reign, the same King Afonso fought a great battle against the king of the Saracens, of name Esmar, in a place called Ourique. Effectively, that king of the Saracens, knowing of the courage and boldness of King Afonso, and seeing that he frequently would trespass the land of the Saracens, causing great destruction and greatly humiliating his lands, wanted, if possible, to engage in battle with him if he was found to be careless anywhere. When King Afonso barged into his territory with his army heading for the heart of his domain, the Saracen king Esmar, having gathered a great number of Moors from beyond the sea that were brought with him, and those who lived on this side of his lands in Seville, Badajoz, Elvas, Évora, Beja, and from all the castles up to Santarem, were present for the clash. Trusting his valor and their great number of men that was expanded by the number of women fighting like Amazons, as later it was witnessed by those that found them dead. As King Afonso was in his camp with only a few men of his, they were surrounded, as if in a headland they stood, blocked from all sides by the Saracens from dawn till dusk. As they wanted to attack and invade the Christian encampment, some of these Christian soldiers were chosen to attack the incoming force, fighting valiantly. They drove them away from their camp, causing great carnage and breaking them apart. While King Esmar witnessed this, the Christian valor, that is, and due to being more prepared to win and die than to flee, he himself deserted, and all that were with him followed, and all that crowd of infidels were annihilated and dispersed either by death or by escaping. Their king, also beaten, would have seen one of his nephews taken, the grandchild of King Ali, named Omar Atagor. With many of his men likewise dead, Afonso, with the help and grace of God, achieved a great triumph over his enemies, and since then the strength and audacity of the Saracens was gravely weakened. This maneuver and victory, although truly surprising, was also due to the fact that entering hostile territory was relatively easy if they managed to avoid enemy fortifications or garrisons, which were always stronger near the border. The problem would always be returning with all the loot and with the enemy force already forewarned. The real location of this battle is still debated today, with Campo de Ourique in Lisbon and the municipality of that name in southern Alentejo being the most likely hypothesis. Many historians seem to favor the latter. This episode became known as the Miracle of Ourique, because of its success in the face of enormous adversity, and also because it was said that it was Christ himself who appeared as a vision before King Afonso Henriques and assured him that he would win by the sign of the cross. Let's not forget the enormous importance of the Christian faith at this time. This victory was so important, especially against such a large enemy force, that, in the aftermath of the battle, his men acclaimed him king that very day. However, the lack of documentation proving this may have been due to the fact that the clerical scribes could not accept as legitimate an acclamation made by soldiers or the people. It had to be made by the Pope himself, and at the time there was no royal chancellery. All the documentary work was done by the monks of the Monastery of the Holy Cross of Coimbra. According to popular belief, King Afonso Henriques was acclaimed according to Germanic tradition, having been raised standing up on his shield. Tradition or fact, it is certain that from 1140 onwards, no document in the chancellery of King Afonso Henriques refers to him as a prince, but rather as king. The Almoravid Empire, which had already been facing a rebellion since 1125, saw its power in the Iberian Peninsula increasingly challenged with the rekindling of the Christian offensive. However, despite the victory at Ourique, King Afonso Henriques still didn't have the conditions or resources to pursue an active campaign of conquest against the Moors, namely the conquest of larger cities such as Santarem and Lisbon, despite having organized annual offensives into these enemy territories. The Almoravids, although weakened, were not completely neutralized. In 1140, they attacked the southern borders, and their fleet even sacked the city of Porto, according to the testimony of its bishop, when the Crusaders arrived in 1147. At the time, the castle of Leiria had probably not yet been rebuilt, and as such, the southern border was somewhat unprotected, which could give the Almoravids the opportunity to attack the defenses of Coimbra. This problem was not exclusive to the county of Portugal, but also to all of its Iberian neighbors, of course. The Christian neighbors also had their own rivalries between each other. So, Afonso Henriques, wishing to continue with his policy of obtaining new vassals, tried to impose himself on Alfonso VII at the expense of the Counts of Toronho and Limia. Since, if Afonso Henriques succeeded in obtaining their vassalage, he would be able to have a growing influence in the Diocese of Tui, something very important for the ecclesiastical lords of Braga. Alfonso VII, who was fighting the King of Navarre, didn't like this and quickly moved to his western border, entering the region between Douro and Minho with his army, conquering several Portuguese castles along the way. Both armies camped on opposite sides of the valley of the river Vish. There were small initial clashes with a small number of men on both sides, and in order to avoid unnecessary bloodshed, the Chronicle of Emperor Alfonso VII says that his benevolence led him to accept a request from his cousin, in which both sides agreed to hold a duel, a tournament to determine the winner without any further waste of people's lives, and, according to the Leonese, to prevent the extermination of the Portuguese army. Allow me to read this passage. When the emperor saw that everything the King of Portugal undertook was becoming prosperous, that good fortune was guiding him, and that God was helping him, while everything was adverse to the emperor, and that if he wanted to compete with him, even greater harm would befall him, he sent for the Archbishop of Braga, João, and other good men, and they asked him to go to the King of Portugal to propose peace to him. This duel, known as the Tournament of Arcos de Valdevez, took place in the early months of 1141, and the Portuguese were victorious. Faced with this scenario, Alfonso VII and Afonso Henriques agreed to return all the conquered castles to the other side, and Alfonso VII banishes the Counts of Toronho and Limia, thus managing to eliminate the main cause of the clash between the two monarchs since the beginning of Afonso Henriques' rule. After the tournament, a truce was agreed, but not definitive peace, and as such, King Afonso Henriques saw no need to submit as a vassal to his cousin, and in return, he would not try to impose his authority in Galicia again. In mid-April 1142, Afonso Henriques granted Leiria a charter and focused on the problems to the south. Leiria was still isolated, with no sufficiently populated territories around it, and its reconstruction made it an easy target once again. The options were to fortify Leiria's surrounding areas, which would be very costly, or to conquer the two squares from where the Almoravid offensives marched from, Santarem and Lisbon. Then, King Afonso Henriques learned of the journey of an army of English, Flemish, and other crusaders on their way to Jerusalem. Afonso Henriques took advantage of their route to convince these armies to attempt an attack on Lisbon, as per the account in the Vita Martini, which I'll quote. Then, unexpectedly, some ships sailed from the Gaulish regions full of armed men that had taken the vows to go to Jerusalem, having docked in the port of Gaia in the Douro River. The king knew of this and rejoiced, as they were about 70, and established with them an accord for all of them to go to Lisbon, the armed man by sea and himself by land with his army, to siege the city, in the hopes to fall in God's good graces by delivering it to him. Therefore, having made this pact, them by sea and the king by land with his army, they went to Lisbon and sieged it, but could not be victorious, because the time wasn't right for it to fall under Christian hands. But they devastated the suburbs, and ruined plenty of vineyards, and burned houses, and brought great destruction to those lands. Seeing, however, that they could not take it swiftly, not even after a long period of time, even if it was under siege every single day, because it was well guarded and had many people and had all kinds of goods in abundance. They abandoned it. The king returned home with his army, and the other men proceeded on their route to Jerusalem. This attempt to conquer Lisbon was a failure, and at the same time as it was taking place, Afonso VII was besieging and conquering the very important square of Curia, thus cementing the idea that he was also proactive in conquering territory in the name of Christ. Over the next 2 years, multiple Almoravid offensives on the southern border followed, one of them being the very violent Battle of Soure, in which the first records of the Order of the Knights Templar arming themselves and going into battle were written. King Afonso Henriques began to realize the importance of this armed instrument, and so, over time, he granted them territories to begin building a close relationship with them. The situation in the Islamic territory began to deteriorate rapidly. Abu Hassan Ali bin Yusuf bin Tashfin was the last Almoravid emir to rule over a united territory. The revolts against the central power had already begun a few years earlier, and this movement was sparked in Portuguese territory by Ibn Qazi, originally from Silves, who made Mertola the seat of his power. He sent a request for help to a rapidly growing new Moroccan sect, the Almohads, whose territory stretched from the south of the Atlas Mountains to the Mediterranean. The request of this ruler and other Muslim lords would, within a few years, justify the conquest of Al-Andalus by the Almohads. We have now reached the year of 1143, and Cardinal Guido de Vico, the papal emissary for the Iberian Peninsula, is traveling here from Rome in order to resolve some issues with the various prelates and rulers present on the peninsula in various cities, including Porto and Coimbra. Arriving in Valladolid, he held a meeting with many of the peninsula's episcopal authorities, but João Peculiar, Archbishop of Braga, presumably in an act of protest or disobedience, was absent, since he had the ideals of a Portuguese church independent of the powers of Santiago and Toledo in Leonese Castilian territory. Arriving in Zamora, Guido de Vico presided over the royal meeting between King Afonso Henriques and Alfonso VII, where the famous Treaty of Zamora took place on the 5th of October 1143. There is little to narrate about the treaty ceremony because its content has been lost. For this reason, there is a historiographical trend that denies its existence or signature, arguing that the relationship between Portugal and Castile-Leon remained essentially unchanged before and after Zamora. However, through Leonese references, we can affirm, with this treaty in mind, that for Alfonso VII, Portugal would be recognized as a kingdom, but this would not cause any threat to his authority since Afonso Henriques would continue to be his vassal, with the boon of being able to better control his Portuguese lords and nobles. In other words, the only thing that would change would be that Afonso Henriques would be seen by Alfonso VII as a king, although he was not yet seen as such by the highest authority, the Pope, and Alfonso VII would continue to enjoy his title of Emperor of Hispania, recognized in 1135, which gave him hierarchical superiority over all the Christian rulers of the peninsula. But Afonso Henriques had another trick up his sleeve, and on the 13th of December 1143, he had the letter Clavis Regnum Coriolum drafted and sent to the Pope. In this letter, Afonso Henriques proposed himself as a candidate for the knighthood of St. Peter. In other words, he proposed himself to be a vassal of the Pope, an act which, if accepted, would free him from the vassalage owed to Alfonso VII. However, on the 1st of May, 1144, the answer came through, in the form of the bull Devotionem Tuam, in which the new Pope, Lucius II, only granted the title of dux, meaning duke, but in fact it was more equivalent to prince, not committing himself to transforming the kingdom into a vassal of the church, despite, having accepted the tribute of 4 ounces of gold. This ambiguous answer may explain why Alfonso VII didn't seem too concerned about his cousin's scheme, even though he almost certainly knew of it. In reality, Rome didn't really know what to do with the Iberian Peninsula as a political construct. On the one hand, it was good to have a single united front in the fight against Islam and to increase the size of the Christian lands subject to the authority of the Church. Moreover, it is likely that those in charge in Rome would not accept the acclamation of a king by his people or by his army. We can state, for comparison's sake, that in the eyes of Rome, a dux was in practice a king for his people, only not recognized by the Church for reasons of legitimacy or political convenience. Of course, risking offending the Emperor of Hispania and losing his support was unthinkable, especially at a critical time for the papacy. So, by not committing themselves to making Afonso Henriques a direct vassal of St. Peter, they were comforting Alfonso VII. On the other hand, the fact that the Pope had accepted the tribute of 4 ounces of gold from Afonso Henriques and had granted him the title of dux meant that the avenue for talks and diplomacy between Rome and Afonso Henriques would continue and would remain open in the future. What is certain is that after the Treaty of Zamora, and especially after 1144, King Afonso Henriques would never again see himself as his cousin's vassal, and Alfonso VII didn't feel threatened in the slightest by his neighbor's autonomy. This last bit may seem a little bit confusing, since Alfonso VII was also a king in his own domains, but this Alfonso was Emperor of all Hispania, a title recognized in courts, in councils, and above all, recognized in Europe. We even have the example of the territories of Navarre and Aragon, which were kingdoms and yet were placed under Alfonso VII as emperor. But we can now see the difference between these kingdoms and Portugal. Navarre and Aragon obeyed Alfonso VII out of fear and respect, as they had already been defeated by Lini's forces. But Portugal, under King Afonso Henriques, was clearly in a phase of affirmation and independence from the kingdom of Leon and Castile, and so it was in his best interest to ignore this hierarchy as long as relations between him and his cousin remained stable. Afonso Henriques, having dealt with this first political stalemate, now in 1145, almost 40 years old, turned his attention to the matrimonial side of his life. But who would Afonso Henriques marry? Well, it wouldn't be a good idea to risk marrying any of Alfonso VII's daughters, as they were related and even to a lesser degree, the Church might not sanction it and would certainly annul such a marriage. Besides, putting himself back under the emperor's thumb by marrying someone from his household was not a good move for someone looking to politically emancipate himself. So King Afonso Henriques sought an alliance by marriage outside the Iberian Peninsula. I will now read you a passage from the annals of King Afonso Henriques that shines some light on the situation. In the year of 1145, King Afonso Henriques received Matilda as his wife, daughter of Amadeus of Moriana, as he was Catholic and very fearful of God. He preferred and chose a woman of modest status and without sin, rather than marry a woman of his own family and therefore sin. He searched all around the world for a wife of royal or imperial status that wasn't bonded to him by blood and found none that wasn't related in the first, second, or third degree, although there were plenty in the fourth degree. So he received her, even though she was unworthy, so that he would not fall into sin, in the 17th year of his rule, and married her by ways of a legitimate marriage. In other words, no European king wanted to marry a daughter of a supposed king of Portugal who was still of dubious status, since this title had not yet been recognized by the Pope. Queen Matilda was indeed a woman of humble origins, but the Count family of Savoy was well integrated into the European royalty of the time. She was first cousin to King Louis VII of France, and second cousin to Alfonso VII of Leon and Castile. Savoy belonged to the Holy Roman Empire, whose monarch was the legitimate holder of the imperial title for Europeans, crowned by the Pope with the imperial crown of the Caesars, therefore being the largest and most important fiefdom in Europe at the time. As the monastery of the Holy Cross of Coimbra had very close ties to the monastery of Saint Rufus of Avignon, and Avignon was close to the county of Savoy, it is suspected that the choice was made with the help of João Peculiar. In addition, there was also the fact that the Savoy family had ties with Bernard of Clairvaux, a French abbot with a very important presence in the church and that would be described as a good friend of the Portuguese people, as well as a staunch supporter of the still growing Order of the Temple that King Afonso Henriques also supported. Lastly, the marriage within the Germanic and Frankish sphere of influence in Europe opened the door to contacts with the Crusaders of the North in order to allow possible future mutual aid agreements. Afonso Henriques marries Matilda of Savoy in Coimbra on Easter Day, the 7th of April 1146, and on the same day, Bernard of Clairvaux proclaims the Second Crusade before the King of France, Louis VII. On the 5th of March 1147, the first child of the Portuguese royal couple, Henry, was born, and in the same year, having managed his political and marital problems, King Afonso Henriques began his offensive southwards. On the 10th of March, Afonso Henriques set off from Coimbra, heading for Santarem. He takes with him a small group of 250 well-trained men, including Knights Templars, in order to do something different. A winter raid, something very rare. As the conduct of honor dictates, at the beginning of March the 11th, the Mozarab Martin Mohab sets off ahead of the troops, heading for Santarem, to warn that the truce between the two sides had come to an end, and that soon an attack would take place. This attack was carried out completely by surprise under the cover of night on the 14th of March, as reported in the chronicles of Afonso Henriques. Maimonides placed the ladder against the wall, climbed up with the king's banner and raised it. Two others climbed up, and the three of them woke up the watchmen, who were still not fast asleep. When they sensed them, one of them said, "Menfu," which means, "Who goes there?" And Maimonides replied that he was one of the watchmen who had been out there and had come back to report, and for him to come down to the bottom. The Moor went down, and Maimonides rushed to him and cut off his head, and told those on the outside to be inconspicuous. As the other watchmen saw this, they realized that there were Christians on top of the wall, and many came at the shouts they heard, and began to slash at them vigorously. Maimonides shouted, calling to his aid Saint James, the priest of Spain. King Afonso then cried out, "Saint James, Saint Mary, Blessed Virgin, come to our aid," and shouted, kill them all, let them not escape, let them all be put to the sword." The head of the Knights of the Temple, Gualdin, was there with his cavalrymen, and they were given 3 ladders at his command, up which he and his knights entered very eagerly. Those who went up were immediately divided into 2 parts. Some fought against those on one side and the others with those on the other. The voices of the watchmen at the gates were now so loud that they couldn't understand each other. Then the king said to his men, "Let's help our men, and let's have each other's backs if we can go up." Gonçalo Gonçalves, with his men, forced his way through the middle, which came from the wicket, so that the Moors couldn't come through it. Then he stormed the gate, so that the Moors wouldn't set up defenses on the inside. As he did, those who were about to go up the ladders on the wall then entered through the town gate much more safely. And when the doors were opened, the king entered on foot with his people, and with his knees on the ground in the middle of the frame, he praised God. The Moors all flocked there and tried to defend themselves, but because the king's men went unnoticed for so long, they immediately entered and killed many of them, as well as women and young boys, and there was so much blood flowing in the streets that it seemed as if a great multitude of cattle had been killed there. There they arrested 3 very rich Moorish knights, of whom the king appropriated a large amount of possessions. We have now come to the end of this 3rd episode. King Afonso Henriques, now with his marital situation settled, and the relationship with his cousin somewhat more stable, decides to push forward in the reconquest of Moorish lands. In our next episode, we will talk about the Great Attack on Lisbon, the death of a great Christian representative on the Iberian Peninsula, and the birth of another. We will also meet a legendary man-at-arms and the subsequent tragedy of Badajoz. We'll see you in the next episode. Take care, kings and queens.